Hello, I hope everyone's done well today.
Good afternoon, Mr. Livingston.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me go ahead on and it's 4 o'clock, so let me go ahead on and call the Richland County Council work session for the zoning rewrite work session. Let me ask Mrs. Mathis to call the roll for council members' attendance.
Okay. Malinowski?
Here.
Hugh? McBride?
Here.
Livingston?
Here.
Teresio? Joe Walker? Barron?
Here.
Overture Walker? Mackey?
Here.
English? Newton?
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. And just for the record, Mr. Pugh did inform me that he will be a little late for the meeting, but he planned to participate. Thank you very much. Next item on our agenda is whether or not there are any additions, deletions, and so forth from the reference to the agenda. Staff, do you have anything to add, delete, or change as it relates to the agenda?
No, sir, I do not believe we do.
Okay, that brings us to the adoption of the agenda. Chair, entertain a motion for the adoption of the agenda to the work session.
So moved.
Moving properly second for adoption of the agenda. There said to be no additions or deletions. Mrs. Mathis, could you call the roll for the adoption of the agenda?
Malinowski?
Yes.
Hugh? McBride?
Yes.
Livingston?
Yes.
Teresio? Joe Walker? Barron?
Yes.
Overture Walker? Mackey?
Yes.
English? Newton?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you. That brings us to item 5 on the agenda, which is presentation of the Land Development Code remapping. Mr. Brown, staff, I'll turn it over to you all now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we wanted to meet with you all as a full body to talk about the Land Development Code rewrite, particularly get the remapping process that is underway. So we have been having the individual council meetings as it relates to the zoning map to get some thoughts and ideas. This will be something similar to what those individual meetings has looked like. So a lot of this information will not necessarily be new to you all individually, but we wanted to bring the body back together to really talk about this more so as a whole. And so just kind of an overview of, excuse me, sorry, I have the wrong presentation pulled up. Excuse me, Mr. Chair.
It's at 17th.
Yeah, I had the wrong one pulled up. That's my apologies. Okay. So what we wanted to talk with you all about today is, again, similar to what we've been looking at with you all individually. And so just kind of an outline of what all we wanted to look at today. So looking at the process that we've been taking. So what all does that entail? How have we gone about doing this remapping? And then looking at some of these questions that had been posed to you all previously, but more so looking at them from a county perspective as a whole versus a district perspective. So having a little bit of conversation about that, but looking at how those questions really inform the conversation around the zoning map and how things look, how things, we think how things should look and how things should feel. Wanted to briefly look at what those zoning equivalencies are. So thinking about the old map and the new map before we take a look at some of those. And then looking at that current map, then looking at the new map that is currently proposed based on the iterations that we've been going through. And again, those are subject to change. And then looking at the zoning districts in a little bit more detail in how they exist throughout the county. And then take a look at that zoning map as a whole again, and then kind of where do we go from here? And so on the agenda, we do have time for discussion later on. And so we would ask that we go through the presentation and kind of hold some major questions until the end. But whatever is your preference, Mr. Chair, we as staff would be open to, but we would really request that go through the presentation first and then address questions at the end.
Okay, I'm fine with that unless one of my colleagues have a burning desire for a question right then so they won't lose it. Other than that, we're okay.
All right. All right. So the remapping process that we've been doing. So again, thinking about the land development code rewrite, and as Mr. Brown mentioned at the meeting the other night, this is a process that, or an initiative rather, that we have been undertaking for quite a couple years now. So the code rewrite as a whole is really made up of these two parts. We have the land development text, and then we have the land development rewrite with the zoning map also. So we've got these two things that is this kind of two-part process. So the text is really just this one piece of the story, and the map is the remainder. And so we have one process for the text, one process for the map, and that is the way that we are intending to move forward with those two things separate. And so the text is really the what, and then the zoning map itself provides the where of how those zoning regulations are going to be existing and where they're going to be applied. And so the text informs the map, which is why we have that process coming along first, because without a complete text, we won't be able to really have a more complete map. Because as things change, as revisions are made, that also impacts how those zoning districts may be mapped, what areas we're looking at for this district or that district. And so until we have something really final and concrete, we won't be able to finalize how that map looks. And so one of the things that we wanted to mention as it relates to the remapping process is we expect to see a lot more interest from the public in the map than we have been for the text. Primarily because the map is going to, again, be showing that where. So where these regulations are being applied, and so how does that impact that property owner individually, or how does it impact that property that's down the street from someone, or how does it impact their relative's house or the like. So we're expecting to see a lot more interest in the map than we have been with the text throughout the process. And so as we've been thinking about the remapping, we have established principles for undertaking this process. And so they're over here on the right-hand side of the screen. So we have developed 8 different principles for how we are going about doing this. So what these principles serve as are these guidelines for how staff should be undertaking the mapping. And they really function as these big ideas and rationale behind the why, which translates into the how we go about doing this mapping process. Because ultimately, this is a technical exercise of reestablishing the zoning map. And so this is very time intensive and again, reliant upon that draft text, which is why so far into this process, we're now able to really begin talking about the map versus only talking about the text. And so from these principles, we're able to develop a variety of rules that establish the way that we go about doing the map. So from these principles, we're able to build rules, which tells us how we're actually doing these things. And so ultimately, this turns into an iterative process where we go through making various revisions based on the rules. And the rules that we have established really kind of build upon one another through each of the iterations. So iteration 1, we looked at a certain set of rules. Iteration 2 looked at additional rules to set 1. Iteration 3 looked at additional rules to those, et cetera, et cetera. And so what we'll be discussing today is the draft process that we've gotten to as part of iteration 4. And so what we're looking to do from here is to really only be undertaking kind of an additional iteration, and then from that have the final map that we would be looking to present to the public, and then be asking council and the planning commission to make the recommendation and vote upon. And so from there, we want to, again, think about some of those questions. And so how are we thinking about development? How are we thinking about growth as it relates to the county? And so just want to kind of take a moment here, Mr. Chair, and really kind of get some thoughts from you all as council members. And we have, again, asked you all, pose these questions to you individually as it relates to your district, but also wanted to get some thoughts related to the county as a whole. And so I guess anything here, Mr. Chair, or other members of council that really sticks out related to these. And again, we're kind of, thinking about these, but, how do we look at this map going forward? And a lot of these questions are really kind of impact the way that we can address some of those things. And so, thinking about these questions, Mr. Chair, we've kind of got some responses individually, but these are really, how we're looking at a variety of different elements related to this remapping process. And so kind of want to keep these in mind as we go through and look at these things. And so, thinking about what an ideal county looks like, how do we see the county changing? What are the types of growth? What are the types of uses? And then where do we might see those things as we're looking at the map? So I just wanted to kind of pose these again here so they're fresh on everybody's mind and kind of what we're looking at in terms of how these relate back to this process. So moving into what we're calling zoning equivalencies, or another way to think about it is translations. And so one of the ways that we've been trying to communicate in terms of how the rewrite is going to be shaping the land development code is that the proposed code is a new code, right? It's not going to just be revisions or updates, but we're going to be adopting an entirely different land development code than what we have now. There may still be similarities. There may be things that are carried forward from the old code into the new code, but ultimately we are looking at adopting a new land development code. And so that's why we're thinking about this in terms of equivalencies, is because not everything is going to be a one-to-one translation. So not everything is going to be apples to apples. And in those cases where they are, it might be a gala to a pink lady. So where it's still an apple, but you might have a slightly different texture, slightly different taste, slightly different feel for what that is, or it could be something else entirely where it's an apple to a pear to a fig, etc. So here we have a graph of what some of those equivalencies might look like in terms of context and character. So what the new district would be, and then what the old district most likely would be as that bullet point beneath. And so again, trying to match it in terms of most equivalent, in terms of character and context of what could be developed as part of that district. And so certain things where looking at the agricultural district that is newly proposed within the code, the most equivalent district that we have within our current code is RU, even though it may not be the best fit, but what you can do within the agricultural district, how it looks, how it feels, that's the most equivalent to the old code. Similarly, looking at some of the residential districts, how those equate between the new code and the old code. So how some of those things might look, how some of those things might feel in terms of what those differences are between the two. So again, thinking about those in terms of an apples to apples translation, the LI district between the old code and the new code, those are things that are relatively similar. There might be a slight difference between the two, but for the most part, they're really going to be the same between how it exists in the current code and what it will be within the proposed code. So again, just kind of showing those and how some of those look. And so for instance, the MU2, the MU3, there's not really an applicable equivalency because it would allow for a type of development and a character development that we can't really achieve within our current code. And so looking at some of those things, we're just trying to provide that information for council, as we know that's been a topic of concern and question of how these differences might look between the two, looking at the old code and the new code. And similarly with some of these overlay districts, we've included those, but we're only going to really be talking about those briefly today as part of this presentation, just really kind of an idea of how those are going to be looked at map-wise versus really going into the nuts and bolts on it. And so again, wanted to look at some more equivalencies, but here, looking at that density. And so on the left-hand side, we have what the proposed district is. On the right-hand side, we have what that old district is, and then the densities that can be achieved with each. And so here you can see a lot of those equivalencies in terms of densities are very similar or just very slightly different otherwise. For some of these, so for instance, the AG Homestead Residential Transition District, those are going to be significantly different than what could currently be achieved density-wise. But in terms of what that equivalency is between the R1 and its the most equivalent from the old district, is slightly different. And so the R1 is still kind of equivalent to what the current RU and current RR would allow for density-wise, but character and context may be something else entirely. And so those are just some of those things that we wanted to point out in terms of how the code is going to be changing, what those differences look like. Because again, this is going to be a new code. We're not looking at it just being an update or simply revision, but being something else entirely that we're looking to adopt. And so before we looked at how we're kind of looking at the new map, we wanted to take a look at how the old map kind of looks in terms of a general view of how the county is currently mapped. So a lot of what you see here graphically is that lightish green color, which is the current RU. And then mixed throughout, you have a variety of other colors, particularly some various shades of reds and yellows, which are going to be, your residential districts and your commercial districts. But the main thing that really sticks out on this map is going to be that green color, as well as some of those pockets of industrial. And so I just wanted to, again, provide that picture here of what some of that looks like, and then what those look like in terms of numbers. So looking at, how many parcels and then the total acreage that includes. And so one thing that sticks out here is the RU district with about 78.5%. And so that's a pretty hefty number when you think about the unincorporated Richland County. So we're saying that, almost 80% of unincorporated Richland County is currently zoned RU. And so the next closest district is HI at 4%. In terms of overall area, overall acreage. And so that's a pretty large amount and a pretty significant difference between the largest and the second largest. And then we have the third largest down here with the RSLD district at 3.5%. So we go, our three largest districts by area are RU, HI, RSLD, when a lot of times what most people probably expect or think to see would be something like RSLD, RSMD in terms of what that largest district is. But thinking about it in terms of overall area, maybe, but when you look at it parcel by parcel case, yeah, most of everything besides RU on an individual parcel basis is probably going to fall within one of those residential districts. But in terms of overall area, not a large percentage of the county would qualify as those residential districts. And so that's important to note because we are deleting the RU district. So everything that was RU has to become something else under the new code. And so we'll talk about what some of those potential options are for it and how it looks, but also why we think some of these are going to be a little bit better than what the current RU provides. Because really the RU functions on two different contextual extremes. You can have, a lot of undeveloped space that is highly, agricultural. So think farming, think the like, or you could have more intense development that equates to residential subdivisions of a very suburban style. So you've really got these two extremes. And then, so the RU district really functions in a way that's probably not true to the name or true to the intent of what it allows for. And so thinking about the new districts and how we're looking at them so far. And again, we're still within this process. Everything is subject to change.
May I be recognized?
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Crooks. I know that you asked us to hold our questions for the end, and I will generally do that except for this one time, because what you said is so huge that I think it would be important to draw attention to what you were saying about the rural areas, because it sounds to me like you're saying that right now when you're looking at Richland County, that the so-called rural designation is something of a catch-all that includes a lot of different types of land, versus areas like parts of the areas that I represent that really are rural. So if you could just take one more minute to address that, what you're talking about in the code does not in any way abolish that rural areas really exist, but rather is looking at making sure that areas that aren't truly what we think of as rural have the appropriate designation, but that we protect the character of those areas that truly are what we think of as rural. I hope my comment makes sense, but I would hate for somebody to wait till the end and have the impression from this part that rural areas of our county are going to go away.
Right. Yes, ma'am. And I think you characterized it very well, that we're not looking to necessarily get rid of rural areas, right? That's been one of the main objectives related to the code rewrite, is developing a code and zoning districts that really equate to a true rural area. So that's one of the problems with the current RU district within our code, is that it really is a catch-all, as you described, that can include a variety of context and character areas. So it allows for development and growth that is very suburban in nature, but it also allows for those that everything in between suburban, bordering on suburban, and then somewhat rural, and then very rural. So you do go along that spectrum. And so one of the things that we have tried to do with the new code is allow for development in appropriate context, and especially those areas that are truly rural. So one of the things that the new code looks at is really breaking up that RU into a variety of new context and characters. So particularly the AG district, the Homestead district, the RT district, and the R1 district, which we'll talk about here in a minute for some of these, is really serves as those replacements for the RU, where it kind of looks at things in appropriate context and appropriate characters, where we do have truly rural areas and truly rural development that allows for appropriate context for how development is being looked at. So in those rural areas, we still get uses, we still have development, we still have overall growth, but it is in context and in character with that actual rural nature as that place exists. Does that address your comment, Ms. Newton?
I think so. We might have to address it again, but I just wanted to pause there, and I appreciate you doing it.
Yes, ma'am. So this is what we are currently looking at in terms of the mapping process as so far. And this is subject to change as we continue on making revisions in terms of the next iteration, but as well as making some additional refinements that we're looking at overall. But again, here we see a lot more variation between the various districts. So again, thinking in terms of how some of that rural area looks, we do, again, on this map, we see a lot more character variation. So we see this kind of medium green, we see some light green, and then we go into, some of those other residential districts with some of those yellows. And so we're trying to have more of that transition, more of those areas be appropriately mapped within the context of the code itself, but also the context of the way that those places act and the way that they have been developing historically also. And so again, looking at that map that we have, and again, subject to change per revisions in the iterations, but this is generally what a lot of that looks like. And so again, looking at what those numbers are, and we see here, without the RU, that RU has to become something. And so a lot of that becomes the AG, so the agricultural district. And we're looking at about, 49, 50% of the county now, whereas previously, RU takes up about 80-ish. So around 50%. And then the RT serving as another one of those replacements for RU, that's about 20% or so. And then R1 is kind of filling out some of that remainder. Because again, a lot of what RU is mapped as currently, it can cover a broad spectrum of areas. So we have places that are right adjacent to the city of Columbia that are very urban that are still mapped as RU. And so not areas that contextually and character-wise are appropriate to be called and be considered rural. But then we also have places that are, down around near Eastover, up in Spring Hill, up above Campground Road, that are truly rural areas. And so how do we then look at those contextually and character-wise? And so a lot of those that were RU become something. And so a lot of that that we're looking at as replacing the RU is the AG, the HM, which hasn't been mapped because it's been part of the public hearing draft, so we haven't necessarily gotten to mapping that portion yet. And the RT and the R1 as being the four major candidates for what previously mapped RU areas become. Because again, it looks at kind of that broad swath that the current RU allows for, but really kind of breaks it apart into more appropriate context in the new code. So again, we're not getting rid of rural areas. We're not getting rid of rural zoning. We're just calling it something different and something that is more appropriate for what can be done and how that development looks and feels within those areas. So here we really want to take a look at how we're looking at the various districts, the zoning districts, but also how those kind of play out within the county. And so what we're going to be looking at here is really a breakdown of how the mapping process has really taken place and what we've been looking at, but it also gives council an idea of how some of these things look within their district itself. And so this is kind of the setup that a lot of the next few slides is going to consist of, where we have what the proposed district is, we have the various council districts, and the total amount of area that the open space is, and how that coincides with the district. So for instance, 25% of the open space district is found within District 1. 2% of the open space district, District 3. 12% of the open space district is found in District 7. So that's really kind of how we're looking at this. And then on the right-hand side, a map of really how those look and how that's set up. And then up here on the top in red is going to be the density that is allowed within that as applicable. So as part of this, again, kind of looking at how we've been applying this as part of this process. And so the open space district really has been applied to anything from parks to private roadways to common space within subdivisions or land that has generally not been able to be developed in any form or fashion. So for instance, Lake Murray would be one of those areas where it's still got to be mapped, but it's not necessarily appropriate to map it as commercial. It's not appropriate to really map it as residential. And so open space, because it is a area that generally would be preserved, would be undevelopable. So having it be mapped as open space. So that's really kind of what we're looking at in terms of the open space district. Is it really is applied to a wide variety of areas, and it really kind of has a variety of context as well. So next we have the AG agricultural district. So the AG district has generally been applied to identifiable agricultural uses on significant tracts of land. These primarily include working lands such as farms, forestry activities, and lands identified with high agricultural value. So for instance, things like the river bottom along the Congaree and the Wateree. And so it's a very, very limited amount of residential tracts have been mapped as AG. And those that have been are primarily those with significant acreage and are surrounded by or are adjacent to agricultural appropriate uses. So things that really kind of abut another district such as RT or the like. And so we have tried to be very targeted in relation to this, even though it may not appear so, but we have tried to be very targeted in the way that we've been looking at this district. And again, where the intent is not to have it as broadly mapped as the deleted RU was. And so a lot of this will likely see some change to the Homestead district versus what we see now. So a lot of how this looks could become that HM as part of the next iteration. And so again, thinking about the AG district really has a significant amount of land that is carried with it. So we do have a 35-acre minimum for this district where it's going to be a contiguous with other AG properties or HM properties. So that is one thing in terms of consideration for the AG and how it is mapped. So the RT district, the residential transition district, this is one that has generally been applied to residential tracts of what we as staff are calling transitional land. And so that's really looking at land on kind of this rural suburban fringe where you're not quite suburban, but you're not quite fully rural as we kind of view it. And for the most part, kind of corresponds to lesser developed areas of the county where kind of development has generally been approaching it, but it's not quite there. And really kind of looking at mapping this as residences or smaller size tracts of land. So really anything between about 1.5 to 3 acres in size. And again, are not in context or use appropriate for being, one of the other more rural districts, so Homestead or AG. And again, contextually, these are not truly rural lots, but are something that's in between rural and suburban in character. And so this is another one of those districts that we may see some changes with related to the Homestead. So a lot of what we have is RT, a lot of that could be shifting and be mapped as Homestead instead of RT. And so the next district is the R1 Residential 1 District. And so this has generally been mapped to residential lots or small tracts of land. So generally less than 1.5 acres that are undeveloped. Primarily corresponds to less intense developed suburban areas. And so these could include anything from residential subdivisions or single properties. And so one way to think about the R1 district would really be a kind of typical or normal district for very low density residential development that is in context and character suburban. And so one way to kind of think about the R1 district and how it's been mapped and kind of how it is being kind of looked at throughout this process. And then the next we have the R2 Residential 2 District. So generally been mapped to residential lots, often found within residential subdivisions or on smaller tracts of undeveloped land. Primarily corresponds to suburban areas of medium or less intense development in character, so moderate intensity. And this really kind of corresponds to kind of a less to moderate intense R district in terms of how it could be applied, what it could be looked at. And so really this is kind of looking at a more moderate intensity suburban style development in the way that a lot of people kind of think about these things. So next we have the R3 Residential 3 District. And this has generally been mapped to residential lots, including anything from single lots to residential subdivisions of varying size and age. And so one way to think about this is it really would allow for kind of your typical residential development found within the county. And so whether that's a residential subdivision or just a general lot that is developed. So when you think of a residential lot, this is generally what a lot of people probably think of. And so we're kind of considering this to be a typical or standard lot that fits a variety of contexts of development. So whether that's kind of more moderate intensity suburban or less intense urban areas, this is really kind of that more so Goldilocks district, if you will, in terms of residential development. And so, this again could be found in more urban areas, could be found in more suburban areas. And so it really runs a range on where it can be found and kind of character and context, what it could entail. So next we have the R4 Residential 4 District. Again, similarly mapped to residential lots and uses, anything from residential subdivisions of varying age to individual lots, all of which tend to be on the smaller size. So really anything between about 0.15 to 0.1 acres. Includes more intense residential developments found within the county. So looking at things like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes. So a lot of that has been mapped as R4 at the moment. And this is really kind of, the R4 really functions as typical district found in urban areas as well as more intense suburban areas. And so kind of this borders more so on the urban flavor than you would probably think about a suburban. And so it's kind of see a mixture of it throughout where it exists, but we'd be on the more higher level, moderate intensity in terms of residential development. And the next district we have is the R5 Residential 5 District. And so this has really been mapped relatively sparingly at the moment, primarily only for residential lots of a very small scale. So really kind of think less than 0.1 acres, as well as certain multifamily uses. So things such as condos, townhomes, apartments, as well as some kind of quadplexes, triplexes, things of that nature. But one thing to note with the R5 district is that mobile home parks that are in a more urban and suburban setting have been mapped as R5. So mobile home parks as they exist would really only be allowed within the R5 and then a couple of other districts. I believe it's the RT and maybe one other within the county. And so for the more urban and suburban areas, the R5 would really be one of the few districts that those would be allowed in. And so that's one of the important things to note about the R5 district is the mobile home park use. So the R6 generally been only mapped to multifamily uses. So again, condos, townhomes, apartments, and residential uses with significantly small lots. And so one thing to note with the R6 is that it has really served as a replacement for the M1 district in a variety of instances where multifamily development was developed as part of M1 zoning. And so this serves as a replacement where appropriate. So for instance, where you had M1 that developed as a apartment complex that kind of fronted a residential neighborhood, the R6 would be more appropriate to remap that than say GC. If everything else around it, context and character-wise, was residential, go ahead and map that use residential instead of making it commercial or something else. So R6 has been one of the various districts that has kind of served as a replacement for M1 in terms of looking at certain uses and context as appropriate. So next we have the planned development district, and this really carries forward where it currently exists. We have not been looking to remap the PDD except for in certain instances. And those really include the former PUDs and single-use PDDs as they already exist as nonconformities. So those would be things that had previous approvals, they've become nonconformities, so they were grandfathered in. And so we're only looking to remap those under certain cases and very appropriately look at those in terms of their context and what they're able to achieve. So for instance, if we had a single-use PDD that was a funeral home and the area around it is all general commercial, other commercial uses the like, well, then it makes sense to bring that use into conformity by mapping it as that commercial district that's kind of surrounding it. Kind of on the opposite end of that, say you had a PDD that was in a more rural area or a more suburban area, and so everything else around it has developed residentially. And so this is kind of a use that kind of sits by itself. It's already a nonconformity. For kind of from staff's point of view, it makes sense to then map it with what that surrounding properties are. So if everything else around it was R1, go ahead and map that nonconformity as R1, where it's already a nonconformity. It would continue to be a nonconformity because we wouldn't necessarily be able to bring it up into conformance for a commercial district because that wouldn't necessarily be appropriate. So the next district we have is the MU1, the neighborhood mixed use district. And so one of the things with this is it really has been mapped in place of the current NC neighborhood commercial district and some of the deleted OI office institutional district as appropriate. And so one thing with the MU1 district then from the current NC is that we have really been looking to apply this a little bit more broadly for commercial uses and at intersections as appropriate to really allow for some of that smaller scale and more service-oriented commercial uses within and around neighborhood areas. So this is primarily in regards to some of the new development standards that are within the code, particularly the neighborhood compatibility standards, where it's going to be looking at things like scale, size, but also some design components where, you know, if there is a desire or want to have more of these non-residential uses in a residential area, they would be really kind of made contextually appropriate through those neighborhood compatibility standards, where again, trying to ensure that compatibility where those uses could still exist, still allow for some of those services, those amenities, if you will, for that residential area without necessarily being overly burdensome in terms of the impact on the character. And so the next district we have is the MU2, the corridor mixed use district, and it has been mapped very sparingly at the moment. And so we really intend for this district to be applied along commercial corridors and within nodes of activity. And so we try to be very targeted in the way that we've looked at this so far, but we will likely see greater application of this as part of the next iteration as we continue through this process. just because we will be looking at some more policy guidance from the comprehensive plan, and looking at things like activity centers, corridors, things of that nature, to where this might be more appropriate versus GC or something else. So next we have the MU3, the Community Mixed Use District, and similar to the MU2 district, we have been mapping the MU3 very sparingly and tried to be very targeted in terms of how we are looking at this district and where it is being applied. And so here we're really looking at major commercial centers and nodes of activity. And so currently really only looking at a handful of locations, but we'll be taking a look at this district in particular as part of the next iterations, and seeing where else it might be appropriate and how we can look at it in context with some of the surrounding areas and kind of what we would be looking to achieve in terms of some of that policy guidance from the comprehensive plan. So the next district we have is the RC Rural Crossroads District. And so this is very similar to the current RC rural commercial, but is just kind of, again, slightly different. And so we've really been looking at applying this at various intersections in the more rural areas of the county. And so generally have included intersections of major thoroughfares that would often allow for a variety of uses. And so really see, similar to the MU1, see this being more broadly applied than the previous RC, where limited commercial is desired to really support those broader community functions. And again, looking at some of those major intersections and major corridors in the rural areas, but also along some of that suburban fringe as appropriate. So we'll be taking another look at this and how it's mapped under the next iteration. And so this is one that you might see more broadly applied than we currently have. Next is the GC General Commercial District, and this has really been applied where the current GC exists. So looking at commercial lots and uses, and similar to some of the other commercial districts within the new code, could see wider application going forward due to those neighborhood compatibility standards, really to help prevent unwanted impacts on residential properties while still providing some of those goods and services. And so one thing to note here is that a lot of the previous M1 properties where they were a commercial service or use were remapped as GC instead of something else. So, you know, thinking about where we're deleting the M1 and how some of those things look, GC has been one of those replacement candidates in terms of that district. So next we have the INS institutional district, and really this has been applied to a variety of institutional uses such as schools, churches, libraries, community centers, things of that nature that may need multiple functions and activities across a variety of use categories. And so this is one that we tried to map very intentionally at the moment because it does have a 5-acre minimum for the district area. But one thing with it is it could see a wide application in terms of future use, just because it really does allow for a lot of elements. So, you know, could be applied in a very creative way, but is really kind of targeted for those various government facilities, educational facilities, research centers, things like that, that may have a lot of different things going on, but kind of wants to still provide some of those things as a overall district versus kind of having a hodgepodge of zoning throughout a concentrated area. And so one thing to note here is it is one of those replacements for OI. So thinking in terms of some of those employment offices, this is one of those potential candidates for it. But for the most part has really consisted of just particularly institutional uses otherwise. Next, we have the EMP employment district. And so this has really been applied to light industrial and employment-oriented commercial uses and development related to its kind of purpose and intent. And so this is probably the most true translation or equivalency for the M1 district, but really wouldn't have as broad an application as the M1 previously had. And so really looking at the EMP being applied in and around employment centers and within the economic development areas. So things like industrial parks and other industrial areas, the EMP would probably see some broad application there. But we do think in terms of kind of how this may be looked at going forward and in the future, that just because of the nature of the district and what all entails, that we could see some relatively creative use of this in urban, suburban, and rural settings as appropriate. So looking at the EMP in conjunction with the AG district. So if you have this agricultural production facility, but you need more so of a manufacturing capabilities as part of that, but you want to kind of co-join some of those, that this would allow for some of those possibilities in terms of how those exist. So next we have the LI Light Industrial District, really again been applied to light industrial development and properties and uses as they currently exist under LI. Really looking at, similar to the EMP, looking at economic development centers, economic development areas as well, other industrial development. And again, serves as a equivalent for some of the M1, where certain industrial uses have been developed under that district. Some of those are mapped LI currently. So next we have the HI Heavy Industrial District, and really been applied to heavy industrial district that often seen as nuisances just because of the kind of the character that those uses give off. And so really a lot of this has been carried forward as exist with some additional application in and around employment centers and where very intense industrial uses would have relatively limited impacts on residential areas. And so one of the things with the HI, looking at some of those industrial centers, industrial areas, where we have those now and how some of these, uses could be looked at in terms of HI. Next, we have the Crane Creek District. And so this is specific to the Crane Creek Neighborhood Master Plan area. And so this is a district that is really only located within that master plan area and along some of the periphery boundary that is found there. So really only looking at a very limited area where this can go, and for the most part is carried forward as it is currently mapped with some refinements in terms of how we're looking at this. And then we also wanted to bring council's attention to some of the overlay districts and how those things are. And so a lot of these are equivalencies and things that are being carried forward as they currently exist. And so for instance, the airport height restrictive overlay, that would apply to the Jim Hamilton, LB Owens airport, where we already have that overlay in existence, and as well as McIntyre related to the airport height restrictions. But also looking at the military installation overlay, which is a new one related to our military installations such as Fort Jackson, McGrady Training Center, as well as McIntyre. So looking at how we look at compatibility for what goes on around those bases, looking at their mission operability and things of that nature. So the military installation overlay would really be mapped particular to those three military installations. So there's a few things that go along with it, but in terms of that overlay, those are where we're really looking to have those things. And then the water resources overlay is a district that has a current equivalency in the environmental protection overlay, which currently, as it exists, only for the Gills Creek watershed. And so we would be looking to carry that forward in terms of this new way as it had been previously. And so that water resources overlay, the only place we are aware of at the moment that we would be looking to have it applied would be the Gills Creek Watershed Association, or excuse me, the Gills Creek watershed versus some other areas. But we'll be looking at having some of those conversations with various organizations and entities such as DHEC and our stormwater division to see where might some of these other areas be related to that overlay. Similarly, the floodplain overlay district, we have a floodplain overlay that currently exists. Those are directly related to the floodplain as determined by FEMA. So that really carries forward as it exists now. And then one of the new overlay districts is the neighborhood character overlay. And so one thing with it is it would only be able to be applied to areas with neighborhood master plans that have a certain, that meets certain criteria. But so for instance, one area that we would likely see application for this in the future would be the Olympia Mill area, because it is a National Register Historic District. It has various elements that might need to be protected, might be preserved. And so looking at things like redevelopment, new development, et cetera, how do we look at some of those items in terms of what they are, what they consist of. And so that's kind of a potential application for that neighborhood character overlay in terms of the future. And so again, looking at how this map is set up currently, and again, subject to change. And so really, we've got some more work that we need to do, and a lot of that is kind of contingent upon how the code is refined over its adoption process in terms of the text. But again, just kind of giving you that visual of everything all together again, for how it kind of looks overall. And so one of the things we wanted to look at as part of this was kind of, where do we go? What does this process look like for the remapping? So really kind of looking at 3 big steps with this. So one is finalizing the draft zoning map. So making further revisions, further iterations that we need to make, and then looking at any changes from whatever the adopted text is, how does that impact what those districts look like, how we might recommend some of those things. So if there's a significant change density wise to one of the districts, well, how does that affect what we're recommending, what we're looking at? How does that address, how does that affect some of the rules that we had in terms of how things were being mapped? So really the big steps for us is going through finalizing this zoning map over the next couple months as we get that final text document, seeing what additional changes need to be made. Also, we're in the process of working with our IT GIS division to develop a map viewer to have this where the public can see it. So it's something that folks will be able to navigate, something that we can say, okay, what was our current zoning? What is our proposed zoning? And what might some of those differences look like all within that application itself? So it'd be something similar to our current GIS app that we have online. So it's similar functionality, but more specific to the zoning map and what we're looking at here. So big step is preparing that zoning map and then releasing it to the public overall. And so we're really looking target wise for that to be late July, based on what we're shooting for the text adoption. So once we're able to get that text finalized, make any final changes, look at those revisions to the map, and then release it to the public. And then from there, we're looking to really have a significant engagement process throughout the month of August into September, where that's where we're looking to have some of those zoning road shows that have been talked about, where we're going to be looking to be out in the community, be out in those areas, as well as continue to have our one-on-one meetings. Because a lot of the conversations around the map are more particular to that one-on-one setting, because a lot of folks are going to be wanting to know, how is it going to be impacting me? So how does that zoning map look for my property, things like that. So from there, looking at an adoption process starting in October. So taking it before the Planning Commission in October and back before you all for first reading approval in October with ultimate adoption tentatively in November. And so from there, meeting that target date for an effective overall code of January 2022. And so we just wanted to kind of highlight what some of those engagement opportunities can really kind of look like in terms of the zoning map. And so one of the big things is kind of those personal interactions. And so we're going to be having an option for one-on-one meetings. So where members of the public or whoever can either come meet us face-to-face, which they're also able to do right now with the text. So scheduling a one-on-one meeting to discuss those, but also discussing the map once it's available by phone, by email, or again, face-to-face in person here at the county. There's also would be that zoning viewer. So people will really be able to dig in and see, all right, how does this look? How is this changing? But then also any of the properties that they have interest in. So if they're always concerned about that property on the corner, well, what might that look like? What is it now? What is it being proposed to? And then looking at our zoning roadshows again, so we anticipate at least 6 locations, if not more. And these would be dispersed throughout the county. So various areas, so multiple in the Northeast, multiple in the North Central, multiple in the Northwest, multiple in the Southeast. So hitting all of our various planning areas and looking at having at least 1 or 2 within each of those locations, if not more. And those would be, hopefully at that point, they're in the public, or excuse me, they're in the community with the public face-to-face in person at various facilities. So whether that's a library, whether that's a school, what have you. And so we would be looking to get those scheduled once we get closer to the release of the map, as well as that finalizing the text. And then also there's always the opportunity for engagement as part of that adoption process. So the public meeting before a planning commission, as well as the planning hearing before you all. And then another item that we're going to be looking at is also mailers with that zoning information. So, you know, how might your property be changing based on what we're looking at? And so that's one of those where we haven't really figured out at what point in the process would we be doing that. But if anything, we would be looking at post-adoption of the map, specifically sending those items out in terms of the mailer of what were you, this is what you are now. And so that's what a lot of that engagement points would be looking at. And we are working with our public information office and our government and community service office on how we can broaden some of these elements, how we can get more of that information out also. But with that, Mr. Chair, that's kind of our presentation for today. And so I guess at this point, any questions, comments, love to have that discussion.
Thank you very, very much for a very comprehensive presentation. This is a comprehensive project. Let me ask my colleagues for any questions. If not, let me go ahead on Ms. Mackey.
Thank you, Mr.
Mac-
Chair. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Crooks and staff for the good presentation. I appreciate it. I guess going back to the map process, and you talked about this process here and kind of the flow of how we would have the map and then present it to the public for engagement. And you mentioned the zoning viewer
Yes, ma'am.
option. With that option, I guess one, and I don't know if you know all the details yet, but I would want to know if the public can actually go onto the map and, you know, click on a particular area parcel and leave a comment within the map, or is it just to view?
So right now it's just to view. That would be something we would need to talk with IT about functionality wise. I don't know necessarily how we could include that, but I think that's something that we could try to potentially explore. So within my next conversation with them, I can definitely bring that up and see if we have that capability. But if anything, we could at least include a email to where if you do have a comment, you just click it and then it pops up your email box to send directly to whoever. So that there may be some option. I just don't know if it's going to have that full functionality of being able to leave the comment in the viewer.
Okay, thank you. And then also, will you be providing information back out to us, the public and council, on kind of what that engagement schedule will be once you finalize those things?
Yes, ma'am. Once we have that finalized, we will be sending that out to you all as well as the public. So as soon as we have those scheduled and ready, we will be providing that through our PIO to the public. Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Cooks, I was wondering, is it possible, for example, I may have a constituent ask me a question like, can you just tell me what are those major advantages of the changes in the rural area, for example? Can we come up with something to say, here's what we perceive as advantage to these changes? Because obviously we're making the changes because we think they're advantageous. So how do we answer a question like that to just give someone a general response about here's what we perceive as some advantages to the changes?
Right.
Whether it's residential, whether it's commercial, or whatever.
Right. So one thing that we try to do overall with all the districts is make them more context and character specific. I know those are some words that I've been throwing out a lot tonight. But so for instance, under the HM district going forward, so say you were previously RU, that district allows for significantly less intense development. So if someone had a tract of land that they wanted to then develop on, they'd have to have a lot more green space based on the general development standards. They'd also be able to put less units on it. And also the types of uses that are allowed within that district are much more appropriate for what that purpose and intent is. So for instance, for the HM, you have a lot more things that are related to agricultural uses and residential uses that's very limited to really kind of single family residences, manufactured homes, things of that, but also a very limited number of institutional uses where you wouldn't have as many, say, commercially oriented institutional uses, but more so just things like parks, community facilities, things of that nature, versus some that are institutional uses, but may not be as institutional specific, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just wondering how I can get that somewhere, something written reference that. So I'm ready to respond when someone asks me about what are some major changes in the commercial districts. And I want to be able to say, here's some advantages of those changes in the commercial districts and things you can do, you couldn't do, or whatever.
Okay.
I don't know how you get to what I'm talking about, but just kind of a cheat sheet to just simply say, give some, not answer the question in detail, but at least give a quick response about here's something you can think about in terms of an advantage to the new district.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so I guess in part to that point, Mr. Chair, so we are working on what we're calling a Zoning Made Easy series. And so we're looking at a variety of different things with it, one of which, and it may not be as cheat sheety as most people might kind of think of, but we have a little kind of what we're calling a guidebook to the new zoning text. And so what it really does is it kind of breaks it down into more manageable pieces, kind of what a lot of that stuff is, and kind of puts it in more shorter, more plainer language, and kind of highlights elements that kind of an everyday citizen may be interested in. So that's one thing that we're going to be looking at, and we're in the process of drafting it right now. So we're still in the process of working on it, but it's really going to try to be condensing it as much as possible, but it's not going to be probably as short as one might want, but I think it'll be at least a good, effective document for looking at the code overall to give everybody a breakdown of everything. I think we're trying to look at what some of those big differences are. So where those changes from the current code to the new code are happening and what some of those things look like. Generally, we may not be able to get at all the specifics, but trying to hit a lot of those big ideas, those big points, and what some of those differences are with it. And so also, as it relates to that zoning made easy stuff, also are in the process of creating a video series, so an animated video series about zoning, about the code itself. And so once that code is adopted, we'll at least be able to have those items come out and help for some of that education component around the new code and what all it entails and what all it'll be looking at.
Thank you, that'd be helpful. I have Ms. Newton and Ms. Mackey. Ms. Newton, you've muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Crooks, for this presentation. I don't know if you presented it a different way or if my brain is more receptive, but there are some things that clicked today that didn't click before. A few questions first about timeline. So you mentioned that there's going to be a zoning viewer, and I apologize if I missed it. What's the approximate timeline for having that available?
So we're looking at that coming out at the same time. So that will be effectively the release of the map. And so we're targeting right now, end of July, early August, post adoption of the text. So in either case, whenever the text is adopted, we'll be finalizing that map and then releasing it as the viewer. So the viewer is kind of that tool for viewing the map.
Okay, and then again, so based on that timeline, it's still the draft map. I guess I think it's important, however the viewer is created, that people understand that we really do want their feedback and that these are just some proposals and aren't final. So the viewer will be a draft for public input then, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. So that would be the draft zoning map of what staff would be recommending map-wise. And so obviously it is the will of council if, wanted to change certain districts as how they're mapped draft-wise, that would be the will of council.
Okay, and then in terms of the meetings, the public virtual meetings that are scheduled for next week, is your intent to present this same information that you just presented, or will that be different information?
So the meetings for next week are specific to the code text. So the information that we have here really probably wouldn't be presented again until later on as part of the roadshow for that final draft map. So obviously these numbers would change, things like that, and probably be a little bit more targeted and catered to the final draft map. But for the meetings next week, it is going to be specific to the text.
Gotcha. And then I have two more questions. I don't see any. Oh no, Ms. Mackey has her hand raised, so I will wait before I ask my other two questions. Thank you.
Ms. Mackey, you recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Crooks, can you talk a little bit about what happens to our current application process for rezoning as we're going through this map review process and start, I guess, public hearings? Are we continuing taking applications for rezoning, or what does that process look like?
So that's a good question. One, I don't know if I'm going to have a complete answer to. But so right now, the intent is to continue to taking those so the map amendment applications probably up to a point, because once we have that, once we are looking at the code and what would be recommended, it'd be how do we start looking at things that come in, things that are in that adoption process in terms of the remapping adoption process versus what is being submitted as a map amendment in and of itself. So that's something that we've been having conversations on in terms of how to look at that. So, the probably the scary word moratorium, but would be specific to the map amendment application versus kind of what has been seen for Lexington County, where it wouldn't be a moratorium on all development. It would just be those map amendments would likely be the case. But we don't know when and to what extent that would be, but that is part of that conversation that we as staff have been having internally.
do you have an approximate time frame based off this schedule where you already proposed we're going to review the code and you want council to adopt, then you want to put the map out to the public, you want council to adopt? Based off this process that you've already presented to us, do you have an estimation based off this process at what point you plan to at least have that decision made?
So we would probably be looking at that. I'd probably say most likely as part of the text adoption, some kind of language in there as part of it. But again, that's a partial answer. I don't know for sure, Ms. Mackey. That'd be something that we would staff would have to take a look at and have conversations on.
Through Ms. Mackey.
Yes, sir. I would just ask that we as council be notified as soon as that decision is made.
Yes, ma'am. We'll be sure to, once we kind of have an idea, we'll be sure to relay that to you all.
Thank you, Ms. Mackey. I have Ms. Newton and Ms. McBride.
Ms. McBride hasn't asked any questions before, so I'm happy to wait for her. Thank you.
Ms. McBride, you recognize?
Just to follow up to Ms. Mackey's question, if there's a moratorium, Mr. Chair, would the council not have to approve that?
Oh, of course, yes.
Okay, so that really would be based on staff's recommendation and council's approval, right?
Right.
Just for clarification, thank you.
Newton, you recognize?
Thank you. And Ms. McBride asked one of my questions, so I'm even more glad that I yielded to her. But to follow up on that, and I do support that we have a freeze on rezoning once we're at the point where we're adopting the code. I think that makes a lot of sense. But in terms of the change, would that be 3 readings and a public hearing since we're essentially changing an ordinance?
I'm sorry, Ms. Newton, I don't know if I caught all of that.
I was just wondering if that would require 3 readings and a public hearing, but I can take that question offline. So I have 2 questions or 3 questions actually, and if they're too in the weeds, I'm happy to talk about them another time. But first, are these slides being made available to the public? And if so, where are they going to be?
So we can, so I guess in part right now, this is on the YouTube. So this is being streamed currently. So the public has access that way. I guess in part to posting them somewhere, I think we were looking to have more so a final draft ready before we really released anything in terms of what that map looks like. So that way, if there was changes as part of this revision process, it's not something that we're looking, if it is some kind of more major change from what revision 1 to revision 2, revision 3, et cetera, all of that is, you know, those could be something more significant. It's not a drastic shock between, you know, what someone saw as this revision to what they're looking at as that final recommended map. So really in terms of providing the map information to the public, we're looking at that as part of that release later on in the summer.
Okay, we'll ponder that, but I guess I would say that some of the information, particularly at the beginning of the presentation, was more general information in terms of some of the changes, broadly speaking, that are being proposed in the new land development code. There were percentages of what each district currently consists of with our current zoning, and those are how things stand now. So I guess what I would encourage us to do is look at, I understand not wanting to have a bunch of versions out there so people are confused when we get to the point for their input, but there was some really, really good information that I see as more static information. So I would encourage us to take a look at that and make that information available. So my 2 questions that I wanted to ask now, well, one was a question about design standards, but I'm guessing that wasn't really the focus of this conversation, and that's going to be the focus of the conversation next week, looking at the text. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. That would be those design standards, depending on, I guess, what you're referencing. that would be a text conversation. Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then in the presentation today, when you looked at R4, can you remind me what that corresponds to, please?
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So R4, and let me go back to that slide too, so we can see it. So R4 again is really, it's a residential district, looking at residential lots and uses. And so here, looking at residential subdivisions of varying age, and also looking at various lots as well. And so on a more individual lot basis, kind of looking at things that are on that smaller size. And so really kind of one of the kind of more moderate to intense end of the residential districts. And again, more so a urban type of residential district in terms of the kind of 6 or 7 residential districts that we have within the proposed code. So this is kind of what traditionally or most equivalent would be the RSHD under the new code, or excuse me, under the old code. And so that would kind of be that most equivalent in terms of context and character, but really kind of looking at a variety of uses within it. So single family detached, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, variety there, but is more so kind of that urban context for very intense suburban development, if you will.
Okay, and then bear with me as I try to ask this question. When I look at the percentage that is currently listed here, does that represent the percentage of parcels that already meet the criteria for this zoning district? Or does it both include current state and then adding additional areas in a future mapping? Does that make sense?
So this would be whatever we currently have within the current iteration that we're at. So for instance, within District 10, we have 2,056 parcels that are mapped as R4. So totaling about 711 acres.
Okay.
So that is what we have mapped currently. So whether that's something that is equivalent now or something that we think should be equivalent or going forward is really kind of how that's looking at it. But what is mapped in the current iteration process as R4.
Okay. And then finally, I was wondering if you could maybe just explain to me a little bit more about what you mean by open space. When I looked at the numbers, I guess I was surprised. I would have expected them to be higher. So maybe I'm not thinking about it the right way, at least as I think about my district. So could you say more about that?
Sure. So the open space district is what is most equivalent to our current TROS and PR district.
Okay. Gotcha.
So, okay.
So that actually answers my question.
Gotcha.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any additional questions? If not, any wrap up, any final comments from staff?
I think for me, Mr. Chair, that we appreciate your time and we appreciate the input that we've gotten so far, and we look forward to continue working with council on this process. And we're excited to see everything moving forward, and we're excited about what the prospect of the new code holds. So I think I'll end with that.
Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is adjournment. Chair entertain motion for adjournment if there are no further questions.
So moved.
Moved
Second.
and properly second. Ms. Mathis, can you call the roll for the vote to adjourn?
Certainly. Malinowski. Hugh.
Yes.
McBride.
Yes.
Livingston.
Yes.
Tracio.
Yes.
Tracio.
Yes. Sorry, it took me a second to get off mute.
Joe Walker? Barron? Over to
Yes.
Walker?
Yes.
Yes. Then you find one.
Mackey?
Yes.
English?
Yes.
Newton?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Thank you all so very, very much. And the meeting is adjourned.